The birth of democratic South Africa was characterized as a miracle. It took years of meetings, some secret, some not, and negotiations to birth the so-called Rainbow Nation. The negotiated settlement involved the National Peace Accord, the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, and various sunset clauses. And as South Africa turns 30 next year, we review and revisit the negotiations that resulted in present-day South Africa and their effects. We're joined in studio by Pali Lehohla. He's the former statistician general. Kashe-Katiya joins us via video link. She's an executive member of Indlulamithi, and Bantu Holomisa led the Transkei delegation to the CODESA negotiations. A very big thank you to our guests and good morning to you. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Duduzile Ramela, let's start with you. When we speak of the negotiated settlement in South Africa, what are we talking about and what was negotiated?
Well, I think one has to frame this in terms of the scenarios that informed this process, particularly the Montflair scenarios that were prepared by Shell. Those really was the deal breaker, and in those scenarios there were three conditions that were supposed to be met that then determined the path, particularly of economic systems in the country. The first condition was, will the transition happen? The second condition was, will the transition happen fast? And the third was, will the macroeconomic policies be populist? If those three conditions were not met, then South Africa would have gone into a particular path of lame duck. Then if those conditions were all met, the promise that was that the flight of the flamingos will persist. And the flight of the flamingos was defined by two things. The first was inclusive democracy and inclusive growth. Certainly, 1994 settlement was inclusive democracy. And it proceeded from 1994 to 2000, but inclusive growth was not there. And that, I think, continues to worry us in South Africa. That continues to be a point of concern in South Africa at the moment, that growth and development have not been inclusive. Many now question, what does inclusive democracy mean? If democracy, which is the distribution of goods and services, material goods and services to the populace, if that doesn't happen, then what is democracy? So that's where we are now, based on the settlement that we had, based on the Shell scenarios that shaped the negotiations. One would argue that at that time, Russia had just collapsed. Michel Gorbachev had come with his glasnost and perestroika. China was not anywhere in the scene. South Africa was literally bankrupt. So, and people were coming from jail and others from exile and others just released to manage a country that was complicated and complex. So, the Montflair scenarios, which are basically based on free market fundamentalism, made South Africa shift from the ethos of the RDP to that free market fundamentalism, which has actually determined our path to this date.
Xolelwa, Kashe-Katiya, Pali Lehohla speaks of inclusive growth and questioning why this growth has not been inclusive. We cannot divorce the past from the present, and so was the new political order designed to fundamentally change the lives of the majority of the people of South Africa?
Thank you, Dudu, for having us, and good morning to Duduzile Ramela as well. I think we've reached a point where we realize that all those ideals and all those hopes and dreams that we had during that moment of transition have not been attained. And through our work now in the new scenarios that Duduzile Ramela and I are working on, because we also realized that the Montflair scenarios that he mentioned actually informed, how we navigate, the pathways to the present. And when we wrote the Indlulamithi scenarios, we realized that there were some key driving forces behind this, because the main issue is that we are still unequal. And I mean, the ideal was to form an inclusive economy, a country that is able to find each other. We're creating greater cohesion, but that has not happened. And the drivers to that being the inequality itself, the lack of a strong and ethical leadership, and also the resentment that we carry with us, as a result of the unattended wounds of the past. So all of those put together have led us to this point where we seem to be more divided than before. We are in a state of lawlessness, wherein there's daily protests, as you're saying. So that resentment now is manifesting in a whole lot of challenges that we're experiencing, from the violent crimes to this disengaged youth, and also just in terms of just the inability to provide even the most basic services by the government of the day.
What are the unattended wounds of the past?
I mean, after that moment of transition, you will recall that part of that transitional moment was not just the CODESA moment. There were some sunset clauses, but there was also the TRC, which was meant to attend to the wound, because we understand that our history was so violent. It was also so dehumanizing on both ends, actually. And the TRC moment was meant to do that healing work. And I mean, it was drawn from psychotherapy, wherein you confess and you speak out, and all these narratives, and messages are actually broadcast, on mainstream media, and in a way to drive a national discourse towards healing. But in the final report of the TRC, there were some recommendations to continue with the work of healing. Part of the RDP, I know Newzroom Afrika likes referring to this, the idea of the RDP of the soul, because we seem to have assumed that that was sufficient and that all will be healed. But what we're finding is that now that wound has become intergenerational, and that's why you're finding this, these issues, these ruptures, especially among the youth, who are supposed to be born free, but they seem to be experiencing the same wounds of the past. So I would say that had we attended to the recommendations of the TRC, and one of them is actually the issue of wealth tax, which has not been implemented. And we believe that leads to this resentment and this wrangling, in particular around the Constitution, which is supposed to be the best Constitution in the world. But we find that South Africans, there's contestation around the Constitution, because it doesn't seem to serve all of us equally. So that inequality also impacts on how we utilize the Constitution and how we actually find ourselves in a more inclusive country, because there's all these divisions informed by race, by class, and many other categories, gender, tribalism, and so on.
Duduzile Ramela, let's trace some of these wounds. Many in society would argue that we find them in the TRC, as Xolelwa Kashe-Katiya has outlined, but some would also argue that we find them in CODESA, the Convention for a Democratic South Africa. How would you characterize CODESA?
CODESA, I think, was a unique moment for South Africa to bring people together after years of divisions, violent, very, very violent divisions. And I think it placed South Africa on a moral high ground. And some said South Africa is punching above its weight. It brought about a constitution, the thinking around what constitution will be, laid the basis for the constitution that we have, which then came into the national law, or rather supreme law, in 1996, the constitution itself. So CODESA gave birth to the constitution, which was hailed as the best in the world. And I would still argue that it is the best, but unless you have instruments by which material benefits are provided for society, then the Constitution becomes a nice paper that sits there. And I think where the failing has been, it's one, the economic policies that we adopted, which were premised on the Montflair scenarios. The government of President Thabo Mbeki in 2002 made a fundamental shift, also based on scenarios which were called the memories of the future, which had scenarios Xoxoloza, Dudisanang, Skedonk, and others. And I think South Africa felt at the time, and the growth and everything were happening. Unemployment had dropped from about 30%, still high, dropped to 22% in the period of 5 years. What one could call the South Africa moment, where growth was quite rapid, averaging 5% a year. And debt to GDP ratio reducing as a consequence of that growth. But then 2008, the financial crisis came, and we went back to the Montflair scenarios. And those Montflair scenarios determined our path. Obviously, the growth that we saw in South Africa at the time consisted of both FDIs and domestic investment, in the particularly leading to gross fixed capital formation, which really was some moment in South Africa where we could say what can happen when government actually leads and actively intervenes in the state. Many say that it was the boom, the mineral boom. Others say it was the build-up to 2010. Hey, there are many stadia that we have to build in South Africa. The shacks are so many, we can build 1,000 more stadia. So why don't we use the same mechanism that we used to build those stadia in South Africa, but build houses and so on. So fixed gross fixed capital formation is very, very crucial in South Africa, but it must use domestic resources. And of course, these are the things that we lost in 2008 financial crisis, and we went back to the Montflair scenarios. So what characterized CODESA was the absence of instruments that would embed tools of foresight to govern and guide our politics.
We're joined on the line as well by Bantu Holomisa. Holomisa, thank you very much for your time. You led the Transkei delegation to CODESA. Pali Lehohla speaks of CODESA birthing the Constitution. What was the intention at the time? Do you remember?
Well, the intention was to free all South Africans, including the erstwhile oppressors. Indeed, they seem to have gained more because these days they are investing all over the world. So, but the original agenda, as we know it, was that let us improve the quality of life for all South Africans. Sadly, that strategy was hijacked or was put aside in favor of looting. A looting which unfortunately was led by the ruling party. We have seen what Zondo had said. We have seen what Bosasa had done. All those billions which should have been channeled to build homes, to build roads, or maintain infrastructure are gone. And unfortunately, Luthuli House, as we have heard, where Bosasa was maintaining or sustaining the party congresses, rallies, and so on, and even using their offices to run elections from. So the CODESA intention was really to put all South Africans under one roof and to find a solution. But you must also remember that in the conflict between black and white, militarily speaking, there was no winner. Therefore, those who opted that we should sit around the table I think they saved a lot of bloodshed in this country. But unfortunately, I don't think that the party which won with majority had trained the civil servants abroad, outside the country. But they made things worse when they removed people with experience and replaced them with comrades. So that's where the whole problem started.
Is that a fair assessment, Dr. Lehohla?
Yes, indeed, it is a fair assessment of what General Bantu Holomisa is saying, that what we have seen is a hollowed state. But the hollowed state is not a vacuum. It still has imbeciles sitting there doing whatever they do and they wish to do. That lack empathy. Absolutely no empathy. Hammanskraal, the way it has happened, 23 people dying from cholera this day and age. Pongola, children, their only scene was going to school, and then a truck filled with coal crashing into them. The children in Ikolobeni, in East London, dying in a discotheque from something that we do not know what actually killed them. The absence of facilities for the youth to enjoy life where they should enjoy life, and their lives terminated so tragically. The miners that die in the abandoned holes that made this country. All these things point to one and one thing: the absence of the empathy that is embedded in the Constitution. So those who have been charged with executing this Constitution lacked one and one thing: empathy and understanding of what that Constitution means. So the general is actually telling the truth, that here we are today, that we have faced two presidents, President Zuma continuously hiding from the law, President Ramaphosa now looking at Pala. Now, we spend more time chasing the presidents instead of the presidents doing what they have to do. That absence of empathy at the highest level is our demise and undermines the Constitution.
We're going to take a quick breather. We'll be back with this conversation in a few moments and taking a look at the next 30 years for South Africa. Do stay with us. Hello again. We're still joined in studio by Pali Lehohla, the former statistician general. Xolelwa Kashe-Katiya is an executive member of Indlulamithi. And Holomisa led the Transkei delegation to the CODESA negotiations as we take a look at the negotiated settlement that is South Africa. But for this portion of the conversation, our dear guests, I would like for us to focus on the future of South Africa. And before we do that, Xolelwa Kashe-Katiya, much has been said about South Africa, and you've outlined this yourself, and a lack of transformation in this country. What seems to be the resistance?
I think the main resistance here is to actually have an honest conversation about where we come from, because we seem to whitewash our history. Even that moment of transition, I mean, a lot was happening. Yes, there was prevention of bloodshed, but there were still the differences existed. As we all know, that the IFP took time to actually agree to participate in the election. We had the PAC and AZAPO also feeling that we were compromising way too much. But then there was this idea of sufficient consensus, which then managed to get us through that moment without bloodshed. But then all those inequalities continue into the present, and we believe that they are worsening. And I mean, it's always said inequality is actually a ticking time bomb. And in particular, inequality with regards to age, because we see this, the youth that is being left behind. And as a result of youth that is actually feeling dislocated, then it actually leads them to have a sense of anger and distrust in anything that has to do with officialdom. And there's also resistance to any process that seeks to actually find renewal for our country. So without attending to that, we are likely going back to that moment, because that moment was informed by a moment of rupture, in particular when Chris Hani was murdered. But then the election date was announced, and I think actually it's quite a nice coincidence that we are actually looking towards the 2024 election, and right now we are facing this moment of youth dislocation, youth anger, and actually when we look at the new scenarios that we are writing right now, we are finding that this is also leading to this emergence of new local and actually global security threats. And it's something that we need to look towards too, because not only do you have transnational crime, you have cyber attacks, there's human trafficking, there's drug trafficking, mass migration, and included, if you put that all in the mix with all these global phenomena like the pandemics that exacerbated all our issues, and also the issues of climate change, but also, you know, the conflict in Ukraine and Russia. I mean, Pali Lehohla even speaks about the trucks carrying coal through Pongola, killing children. If you look at that, you know, it might seem like something that's just a microcosm of something else, but it actually has a direct link to, you know, those global impacts, you know, and we are right at the heart of, you know, what is happening there in Russia and Ukraine. And also you look at the issues of climate change combined with that, because why is coal leaving South Africa to Richards Bay, and what does that mean in terms of the future? And these things are manifest in, you know, the burning of trucks along the N2 that we've been seeing. But we need to just bring it all together and try to imagine where we're going, because I believe that we are now again facing that moment where the country may just go off the cliff. But without strong leadership, not just in government, I know we tend to focus on the state and the weaknesses of the state, but big business has a big role to play, especially if you look at the recommendations of the TRC. We still don't have an activist business, really, because they need to also fall in and be part of this agenda, and so is civil society and other social partners. So it's not just an issue that can be dealt with by the state alone, because we all know that the state is not capable of doing these things on their own.
Holomisa, what has been your reading as to the resistance towards changing the lives of the majority of the people of this country fundamentally? Okay, I think we have lost Bantu Holomisa, but...
No.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. What was the question?
Your reading as to why we have not managed to turn the tide as the country. What has been this resistance to transformation and changing the lives of the majority of the people in South Africa?
Well, unfortunately,
it is unfortunate because we're not able to...
We are competent people to implement the policies which were developed collectively by all South Africans. You'll recall when we started the consultations, the RDP policy, and then this was changed midstream that the state cannot afford this expensive exercise. Then we went back to GEAR and many other policies which were still not being implemented. But the bottom line is that all these policies have never been intended to empower the black majority. even the so-called BEE. People were expected to go and partner with white-owned companies. But if you compare, for instance, with what Matanzima did in Transkei, Transkei was only independent for 18 years. Compare that period with what ANC has done in the 29 years. All 28 towns of Transkei, the land there is in the suburbs, CBDs. Those properties were sold to Transkeians. They own properties. But today, you can go to Elof Street, you take Commissioner Street, you go to Strand Street, and you ask somebody and say, who is owning this property? It's Van der Merwe. Where is he? He's in Australia. This one, Unattended, where is he? He's in Canada. Where is the property portfolio for the Africans? Where have they built these portfolios? They will say, I want to build a property, or buy a property. I can't. I want to build it for myself, but I cannot because I don't have access to capital. So that's why the UDM has been calling for an economic endeavor, because we didn't finish the work at CODESA. We panicked beyond comprehension when Christian was assassinated, and we demanded a date for elections. But we didn't sustain that after that. We got political power, but we didn't continue or pressurize as to what kind of model of economy which would assist the poor black South Africans. Remember that at one stage the Afrikaners were poor like us when they were under Amangese. But when they ascended to power, they made it a point that they are going to make sure that they subsidize certain areas, farming, mining, and so on and so on, education. But I don't know what is the ANC government is doing, because it looks like they are always trying to react, or they are in a crisis. And of course, the people they put in these positions were just placed there to make sure that the monies are channeled back to the ruling party. How can a ruling party be responsible for stealing and nobody is taking action against them?
Pali Lehohla, I'd like for us to bring up this image. But Holomisa speaks of the panic and wanting to get a date for voting in South Africa. Let's go to 1994 and take a look at this image. These snaking queues that have since attracted so much attention over the years. Today what you see is snaking queues at the presidential imbizo. President Cyril Ramaphosa had the presidential imbizo this week, and there were throngs of people that were waiting to get into the stadium. It was still being put together in terms of the tent, and those people were waiting to tell the president about their concerns, to tell the president about how their lives have not changed and how they continue to be plagued by a lack of service delivery, amongst many other issues in the country. So when we speak of policies and this best constitution in the world, why is it not landing?
Well, I still maintain that the Constitution is still the best in the world, because it offers a possibility in a legal way of making South Africa real free and prosperous. That fundamental is there in the Constitution. From a Constitution, then you have to create laws. But I think some of the laws that we have created fundamentally misunderstand, or rather the policies and then the laws. And then in the execution of these policies, you find that the policies are not coherent with what the reality is on the ground. Because if the policies were good, then why are they not implementable? In many instances, I believe that the policies are not that good, and the laws are impractical to implement bad policies. Let me make an example. Economic policies fundamentally are not going to resolve the problem of poverty in South Africa. One, they're based on free market fundamentalism. And this free market fundamentalism are driven by, or step back, to manage an economy this big, you need models, econometric models, economic models. The models that we are using of CGE do not put at the center, and they cannot calculate the levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment going forward. They can only deal with GDP growth, debt to GDP ratios, and other macroeconomic indicators like money and exchange rates and so on. Those are the things that are possible to deal with under CGE. Now, if you look at the IMF report, it encourages us to go on that path. In terms of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, it goes and looks at case studies. They are not embedded in the model. So you cannot predict what will happen to those. These are taken as beneficiaries of largesse of this free market fundamentalism. There has to be models that put unemployment, poverty, and inequality at the center of what we do. And then around that, then we can project using econometric models. Our models are fundamentally flawed, and they are not going to take us anywhere soon. The ERRP has the same difficulties. Why do you think the president cannot commit to saying we'll reduce poverty by X in year 20-something? Why is he unable to say unemployment will rise to this level? It's because the models we use don't give us that possibility of projecting into the future. So nobody talks about impacts. So there is a fundamental problem of policies. There is a fundamental problem of instruments. There is a fundamental, basic, and more fundamentally, the problem of intellectually understanding what it is and what it means to govern.
What does that mean?
What it means is society must get benefits. To do so, you have to have a predictive model that shows that it is possible to provide those possibilities. We don't have it.
Xolelwa, Kashe-Katiya, as we wind down the conversation, what do you say to a South African who is turning 30 years old? Their only option is to access debt because, and even with that debt, right, they're not able to service it. They have not had a job. They do not have property, or a 30-year-old that does have property, but because the rates are so ridiculous or the bond is so ridiculous that they stand a chance of losing that. What do you say to a 30-year-old who is looking at South Africa in 2023 and thinking, yo, but CRP?
I think for me it is very difficult for a 30-year-old South Africa because, as the point of departure for this conversation was the fact that the economy is not inclusive enough, and that's why we are experiencing these challenges. But what we forget is that there is a lot of wealth in South Africa. As much as we can talk about the poverty and inequality, part of that, like inherent in the inequality, is the fact that there is a lot of wealth. And without compelling the wealthy or the elite to actually come to the party, because it's easy for us to point towards the state. So once again, would like to bring about the idea of a collaboration. And I know that the president is always punting the idea of a social compact or social contract, wherein, different parts of society are actually compelled to take the country forward. Because at the moment, it seems like we're all just folding our arms and waiting for a state that is not capable, a ruling party that is also not capable to lead. And without that, a strong leadership, we will not be able to compel the rest of society, especially big business. We have seen some successes in terms of ways in which business was compelled to actually contribute, and that was how we responded to the pandemic. That was a good example of, a moment of crisis wherein we saw evidence of activism, and also we saw labor also rising up, something that was reminiscent of, the movements of the 1980s that led to that moment of negotiation. So if we can find it in ourselves to actually maybe consider a CODESA-like moment. Others have said that there was a need for a CODESA Part 2, wherein we follow those principles, because once again, we are in a moment of crisis. We are about to fall off the cliff or at that tipping point, and it does require all of us, like we did in the past, so that we can find each other first and foremost in terms of where we are going as a country, because without that, we cannot even begin to find those agreements or forge those social compacts. But that still requires strong leadership, and I doubt that we have that at the moment. Maybe from the young people, maybe we could look to young people, but then we have to find ways to include young people meaningfully.
Bantu Holomisa, what do you say to somebody who was standing in those snaking queues in 1994, waiting to vote for a birth of a better tomorrow?
Well, they voted, and for the first time, this country was in the hands of the black majority. But what we have witnessed now is that putting all your eggs in one basket is not going to help South Africa. We are once more asking the voters to go and vote next year, but vote for what? Are they still going to vote for a party which has failed the country in the last 30 years? That's why there is a need to talk about a new alliance, because the tripartite alliance, as we know it has failed South Africa. But in going back to what was raised by Prof, is that we may have to look at the mandate of the Reserve Bank, and at least they must try and put the issue of employment as one of their mandates, not just to focus on inflation. The new government, after next year's election, should also reconsider bringing back or incentivizing certain industries like agriculture, so that at least some people who are not making it to cozy positions or which requires education, is that they be accommodated and be trained in the agriculture, and also do away with some of these tender systems which are intended to maintain government buildings and rural roads. Because tender comes once a year, and then the rains come and they washed everything away, and there are no units, maintenance units to maintain those. So there's a lot which needs to be looked into. But more importantly, is that South Africans must converge not too far to look into these problems. Call everybody under one roof. And then whatever resolutions taken there should go and be implemented or endorsed in Parliament. No argument in Parliament, but we carry the mandate coming from such a national convention. Whether we need CODESA, whether we need that, but we cannot...
Look.
No, it's not going to be sorted out. Not under the current policy regime. The current policy regime, let me say this. 2008, a 15 to 34-year-old would have had a job, or the unemployment level was much lower. 1.6 million of those who are 15 to 24 were employed in 2008. 4.8 million of those who are 24 to 35 were employed in 2008. From that point on, the population kept growing. Today, compared to 2008, only 1 million are employed 15 to 64. So it's 600,000 less against the growing population of the youth of 15 to 24. 4 million are employed against 4.8 million amongst those who are 24 to 35, 24, 25 to 34, against the growing population. That is 800,000 less. So the growing population is bound not to find jobs. The growth is only happening at those who are 35 to 64. That's where employment is growing. So a 30-year-old today should know life is going to be tough. A 15-year-old today must know that there's no future in this country unless we change the economic policies. And this IMF World Bank-based policies that we have followed up to so far, over a 30-year period, have yielded the same result. And today we are told that the ERRP will change. It will not change anything. The Harvard professors were here again, dishing out the same medicine that we have seen has generated poverty in a country that is so wealthy. Promoting DFIs as though we don't have domestic resources, including government pensions, which can actually be invested and injected to grow the economy. Of course, you don't want a corrupt hand at the till. Yeah. But if you imagine DFI will come in corrupt hands, it will not come when your own hands are so dirty to handle public affairs. The failure to manage and immerse ourselves in public affairs is at the heart of our failure. But including in that, the prime evil is the economic policies that we have actually got involved in. In fact, that is the fundamental source of corruption that we have seen, because it generated tendering processes, it generated all kinds of things that are not sustainable. So, long-term planning of a 90-year horizon is what we need to say, how will this person who will live for another 90 years who is born, what will be the stages of life that he goes through? This nonsense of saying that long-term planning is not, keep it at 5 years. So, no. We know that life continues up to 90 years. You can plan long-term for 90 years, despite the uncertainties. Thank you.
A big thank you to our guests this morning. Pali Lehohla, thank you very much. Former Statistician General. Bantu Holomisa and Xolelwa Kashe-Katiya, thank you very much for your time this morning.